Lagos residents have condemned President Muhammadu Buhari for his speech where he called for an end to demonstrations against police brutality. According to a Reuters witness, a highway leading to the Lagos airport was obstructed by blockades manned by groups of young men demanding cash from motorists. In the east of the city, in the Ibeju area of Lekki, armed men chased away police and several police stations were burned to the ground. The latest unrest follows a bloody response by security forces to demonstrators on Tuesday, where, according to Amnesty International, 12 people were killed. The protests demanding police reform have been ongoing for over 2 weeks now and represent a political crisis for Buhari. And joining us now to establish why this protest led by youth is different and what lessons Africa as a whole can draw from it is Dr. Richard Manang, author of the book Making Africa Work Through the Power of Innovative Volunteerism. Dr. Manang, good evening and thank you so much for your time tonight. Let's just begin here. I mean, these protests have really gripped not only Nigeria but certainly the globe. And, you know, a lot of people have been talking about them, and the issue of police brutality is certainly not new, particularly when it comes to this country. What do you make of these EndSARS protests?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I will start off with an Afrocontroller, which goes that little by little grows a banana. What this proverb means is that if we do not appreciate progress, we can never make progress. Rome was never built in one day. And what this means is that we must appreciate the democratization process that Africa has come of age. And so when you look at what has transpired across Africa from a democratic process, over 60% of countries from data is showing that Africa has actually moved forward. The second aspect, to put things in perspective, is that when you look at the deprivation anywhere in the world, the despair of joblessness is actually the biggest deprivation that happens anywhere, whether it is the pain of a father or mother unable to buy food, to put food on the table, or it is the pain of a mother or father unable to send kids to school, or it is the pain of over 12 million youth who graduate into the labor market in the entire continent competing for lesser jobs, or it is the pain of the changing climate that is plunging people to seek sanctuaries in places not their own. This is what is causing despair. And this is not just for the youth, but it's for everybody in the continent. So what needs to happen is a different kind of narrative where we move from confrontation to a conversation, where these young people, because most of them were actually born after the 1990s, and they grew up in a different era. And so they have a different way of doing things. They have different perspectives. They have different solutions. And so bringing them to the table to converse around how to devise solutions around these challenges of food insecurity, challenges of unemployment, of joblessness, is what is needed in the entire continent tonight.
And when you look at these, these protests that we have been seeing in Nigeria, what makes them different?
The reality is, when you look across the entire continent today, as I've said, the young people across the entire continent are tech savvy. They grew up in a different era. They understand the world differently as it was in the 1960s, as it was in the 1970s or 80s. And what does that mean? It means that they have a different way and a different thinking, which is great. They are over 60% of the entire continent population, and they are Africa's sovereign capital. And what that means is that we must see them through the solution space, because when they are made to know that they're solution providers, they can be able to use their tech savviness, their energy, their creativity, to be able then to start solving these challenges. And to your question, what is making protests different anywhere across the continent and elsewhere, even across the globe, is the despair of joblessness that I've mentioned, is the despair of hunger, the despair of people, not just youth, everybody, especially with COVID, that has actually added to this, with projections showing that job losses in the continent could actually reach 50%, and Africa could actually get into recession, which is going to be the first after 25 years. So the point is that when you combine these challenges with pandemics or emergencies like COVID, and on top of it, climate change, we might just see words. But the point is we must turn this challenge into an opportunity. by recognizing that youthfulness is usefulness, youthfulness is value, and engage this youth, because there is something that we miss across the continent most of the time, which is an inspired and passionate human being can actually turn a challenge into an opportunity. And therefore, we should never ever put youth and problem in one sentence. What we need is to put youth and world and solutions in one sentence and inspire them to see themselves as the catalyst to devise solutions to address these challenges. And I go back to the same point again. We need a conversation with the young people, not a confrontation, because state doesn't have all the repository for solutions. Neither do youth have all the repository for solutions. So state and non-state actors must be able to work together. And more importantly, the youth constitute the biggest non-state actors constituency. So to drive any meaningful transformation in the continent, for the betterment of the continent, they must be at the center of also providing the solutions.
And I mean, Dr. Richard, it's not only a conversation that really appears to need to be happening here, but also not excluding them from positions of leadership. Because when you look at, across the continent in particular, we are seeing quite a lot of older leaders, and more young people are not finding their way into these positions of leadership. And certainly young people, as you say, are sending a message, and the message is clear. They want to be part of the solution, but certainly they should also be in leadership positions.
The reality is that the era of leadership seen only from a political perspective is long gone. Leadership is personal responsibility. If you cannot lead yourself, you cannot lead anybody else. And therefore, inspiring youth to know that you must not necessarily only be in political office to be a leader is important. That if you can be able to use your passion and turn your passion to profits, turn your skills and talent to devise solutions from the challenges we're facing today, that is leadership. And what we need to also understand is that the era of government developing policy, implementing policy is long gone. So each and every one of us must become a leader. And this is the narrative that Africa urgently needs today, because when you look at these young people, they're already leaders in their own rights. When you look at the solutions they're coming up with, they come up with innovative ideas, whether it is in telecommunication, where they're devising mobile applications all across the entire continent today. That is visible. Whether we're looking at innovations and ideas, they have them. But what has been missing in the entire African continent, and I think this is quite very, very important, is narrative. The narrative of Africa has been about challenges, not about solutions. It's always been about challenges. Whether we're talking about challenges of mothers who go to bed hungry, which is true, 257 million of them. But we hardly hear a narrative of youth turning their skills and talents into devising solutions that can be able to reduce the post-harvest losses that are costing the continent $48 billion US. We hardly hear the narrative that if we are able to inspire youth and motivate them and guide them in a very structured way and invest in them, we can then be able to actually turn waste, agricultural waste, to fuel briquettes that will replace the charcoal that is actually causing deforestation. We don't hear the narrative that if we are to leverage on communal cooperatives, which are in every community in the African continent, we can actually start to tap into different kinds of finance. And this narrative of challenge and victimizing youth and talking about how youth are victims of circumstances, instead of coming up with a formidable narrative of youth as solution providers and inspiration and inspiring them, is what needs to change. Because if we don't do that, what will happen is that the sovereign capital, in this case, which are these youth, 60% of the population, we might not be able to unleash and tap that potential in the youth to address these challenges of food insecurity, challenges of the unemployment, and challenges of mothers going to bed without putting food on the table. So we need an urgent change in narrative. What I call the urgent, fierce urgency of now for Africa is a change of narrative from challenges to solutions. We talk problems, we talk challenges. It's time now to start talking solutions, and youth are actually the solution providers that need to be on the center stage.
And talking about, what needs to happen at the table to ensure that, things move forward, even talking about self-leadership. But I also want us to look into this. The president of Nigeria, has spoken out and called for calm and not touching on what you're talking about, which is critical, the issue of responding with violence, the issue that we then saw, culminating into violent clashes at that Lekki toll gate. Do you think he missed an opportunity when it comes to really addressing and getting the situation under control? Because we're still seeing protests continue to this day.
Africa has a population of over 1.2 billion citizens, and each and every one of us who is from this continent have a responsibility to be able to discuss with the youth. It is not only those in power, or presidents or prime ministers or political leaders, to talk about what needs to happen to calm the youth down in any part of the continent. We have a sole responsibility as citizens of this continent, and even citizens of the global community, to be able to inspire youth, to tell them that the approaches that cause the problems that we face today in the continent, whether it is problems of food insecurity or problems of joblessness, cannot be the same approaches that can be used to address the same problems. And therefore, we need to think out of the box, because I always say this most of the time, and I put this in my book, we cannot address the current challenges by using the same approaches. So we must develop new models that make the current approaches that perpetuate these challenges obsolete. What does it mean? Each and every one of us must inspire one another, especially the young people, must guide. We must all take responsibility to not only wait for political leaders to speak, but to also speak in inspiring youth, to speak in motivating them, and at the same time ensure that we start seeing them as solutions rather than as part of the problem, because they're actually the solutions that can be able to ensure that we achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and actually achieve Agenda 2063, which is to create the Africa we want. We cannot create the Africa we want when the youth are not at the center. But one important point which is very key is that youth is not static. And I think this is important, because those who are youthful today, in 10 years' time, they will move out of the age bracket of youth. So if we don't start seeing ourselves, regardless of age, as solution providers, because in 10 years' time, where will those who are youthful today be? And there is an African proverb that does that where you will sit when you are old will show where you stood in youth. So where will the youth of today stand when they are old? I believe they will want to stand where the solutions are, and therefore seeing self as a solution provider and taking into consideration that leadership is also personal responsibility. And just imagine 1.2 billion African citizens playing the leadership role in their respective capacities regardless of what they do. Africa will be a first world.
Dr. Richard Manang, thank you so much for your time tonight. You've certainly given us something to think about, particularly as you say, self-leadership is quite critical. And as you say, youth is not static. That is really a very important point to end off this discussion. Thank you so much. We do appreciate your time. That was Dr. Richard Manang, who's the author of Making Africa Work Through the Power of Innovative Volunteerism.